There are cold cases in the American historical record that stay cold not because the evidence is insufficient, but because the community that held the evidence made a collective decision to keep it cold. Not through conspiracy, not through any coordinated effort among individuals who met and agreed on silence, but through the slower, more natural process by which communities in isolated places absorb what they cannot manage through official channels and carry it forward in the quieter registers of memory and avoidance, and the particular way that certain properties in certain hollows stay empty for a very long time after the people who lived on them are gone. The Gooch family of Clay County, Kentucky is one of those cold cases. The family's name appears in the Clay County property and tax records from 1859 through 1879. After 1879, it does not appear anywhere. The family, a husband, a wife, and 4 children whose ages ranged from 6 to 17 at the last documented sighting, vanished from official record of Clay County without explanation, without a forwarding record, without any notification to the county of their departure. They simply stopped being present in the documentation. This happens in rural counties in the 19th century. It happens for many ordinary reasons. In the case of the Gooch family, the ordinary reasons were not the reasons. What happened to the Gooch family is not fully documented because the people who knew were people who had decided not to put what they knew into any form that an official record could contain, but the edges of the story exist in 3 places: a letter written by a Clay County circuit preacher in 1881, a deposition given in an unrelated civil proceeding in 1883 that contains a passage of testimony with no apparent bearing on the matter being adjudicated, and a single entry in the private journal of a Manchester physician named Dr. Warren Hibbs, dated November of 1879. That is the most direct statement of the matter available, and that Dr. Hibbs appears to have written with the understanding that no one would read it until he was beyond the reach of any consequence it might carry. Drop your location in the comments before we go further, because what Dr. Hibbs wrote in that journal entry is the kind of statement that a careful man writes only when he has decided that the weight of knowing is greater than the weight of saying. Clay County, Kentucky in 1876 was salt country. The salt works that had driven the county's economy for decades were in decline by this period, but the communities of the county retained the character of a place built around a specific and demanding industry, and the people of the outer hollows retained the independence and the insularity that that character produced. Manchester was the county seat and functioned as a real town, with merchants and a courthouse and the apparatus of local governance. The communities in the drainage hollows that ran out from the main river valley were something else. They were places where the county's authority arrived infrequently, and where the management of community affairs, including the management of disputes, injuries, and events that in a more accessible community would have come before a judge, was handled internally and quietly and without the involvement of anyone from Manchester, unless the situation had reached a point that internal management could no longer contain. The winter of 1875 into 1876 had been hard, the kind of sustained cold that pushed people deeper into their properties and their own resources and made the distance between a hollow and a town feel greater than the miles warranted. The Gooch property was on a creek drainage in the eastern section of the county, 4 miles from the nearest community of any size. There were 3 neighboring properties within a mile of the Gooches. The families on those properties are the source of what is known about the events of 1876 through 1879, because they were the people who saw what there was to see and who carried what they saw in the ways that people in their position carry things, not by speaking of it publicly, but by the accumulation of small behaviors that document, to anyone who knew how to read them, what had happened. The Gooch family consisted of Lester Gooch, who was 41 years old in 1876, his wife Marvella, who was 37, and their 4 children, 2 sons and 2 daughters whose names appear in the tax record as Clem, age 17 Ada, age 14 Pris, age 10, and the youngest, a boy named Hoyt, age 6. They had farmed their parcel since 1859, when Lester's father had acquired the land and Lester had taken it over following his father's death. They kept cattle, hogs, a kitchen garden. They were not, by the accounts of their neighbors, a family that anyone found remarkable in any way. They were present and functional and paid their taxes and appeared at the community church on the ridge with the regularity that people in that community expected of each other. What changed in 1876 was the meat. The observation came first from a woman named Rhoda Benge, whose family's property bordered the Gooch parcel to the north and who had known Marvella Gooch for the 17 years the 2 families had been neighbors. In a deposition given in 1883 in a land dispute between her husband and a third party, a deposition that covers 60 pages of testimony on subjects entirely unrelated to the Gooches, and that contains on page 47 a passage of apparently spontaneous digression that the court clerk recorded verbatim and that has never been explained in terms of what prompted it. Rhoda Benj stated that, beginning in the autumn of 1876, the Gooch family had begun producing and offering for sale quantities of smoked and dried meat that were inconsistent with the number of animals they kept. She said she had purchased meat from the Gooches in previous years and had thought nothing of it. She said that in 1876, the quantity available changed in a way she noticed. She said that Marvella Gooch, when asked about the increase, had said only that they had had good luck with the hogs that year. She said she had accepted this explanation at the time. She said, in the deposition, that she no longer accepted it. The circuit preacher who served the communities of that section of Clay County in the early 1880s was a man named Reverend Josiah Gant. He made a circuit through the outer drainage communities 4 times a year, conducting services and visiting households and maintaining the pastoral correspondence that was the only form of community record-keeping in places where civil record-keeping did not reach. A letter he wrote in March of 1881 to a colleague in Hazard, a letter preserved in the Hazard, correspondence papers and donated to the University of Kentucky's Special Collections in 1952, contains a passage in which Gant discusses the Gooch property without naming the family directly. He describes a property in the eastern section of his circuit where he had stopped making pastoral visits after 1879, and he explains why. He writes that on his final visit to the property in the autumn of 1879, he had found the family in reduced circumstances. Reduced in number, he writes carefully, without elaborating on what he means by this, and that he had observed during his brief time at the property things that he could not reconcile with any explanation he was prepared to put into a letter. He writes that he had not reported what he observed to any civil authority because he was not certain that what he had observed was what he thought it was, and because the individuals who would have been affected by a report were beyond the reach of any intervention he could have provided. He writes that he has continued to include the property in his prayers, and that he has chosen to understand his silence as a mercy rather than a failure. He writes one further thing, that the neighbors of this property, in the years since his final visit, have declined his pastoral services as well, and that he understands their declination as the behavior of people who share his uncertainty and have made the same choice he has made. Dr. Warren Hibbs had been the physician serving Manchester and its surrounding communities since 1868. He was, by the account of his colleagues in Hazard and Barberville, a methodical and unsentimental man who approached his practice with the same precision that characterized his private journal, a journal he kept from 1868 until his retirement in 1903, deposited with the Clay County Historical Society after his death in 1911, and available to researchers through the Manchester branch of the Clay County Public Library. The journal is a medical record as much as a personal one, and its entries are dominated by case notes and clinical observations. The entry from November of 1879 is different from every other entry in the journal. Hibbs was called to the Gooch property in October of 1879, called by a note delivered to his Manchester office by a man he did not recognize, a note that said only that there was a medical situation at the property requiring attention. He made the ride out in the cold of an early autumn and arrived at the Gooch property in the afternoon. He was met at the door by Lester Gooch, whom he had seen twice previously in his practice. He wrote that Lester Gooch looked, in October of 1879, like a man who had been carrying something heavy for a long time, and who had reached the point where the weight was becoming visible in his face and his posture and the particular way he moved, which was the way of a man who had stopped trusting his own judgment about what was and was not manageable. Hibbs was brought into the house. He examined what he was brought to examine. He does not specify in the journal entry what the medical matter was, writing only that it was the kind of matter that his presence could not address in any useful way, and that the appropriate response was the one he provided, which was to do what he could and say nothing about the rest. He writes that while he was present in the house, he was given access to a room he had not been invited to examine. He writes that the access was accidental, that a door was opened for a purpose unrelated to anything medical, and that he was able to see for a brief period into a space adjacent to the main house that had not been part of his tour of the property. He writes that what he saw in that space confirmed the interpretation of events that he had been forming since his arrival at the property, based on a number of observations he had made in the course of his medical examination that he had not commented on to Lester Gooch or to anyone else present. He does not describe what he saw. He writes, instead, the following: I have been a physician for 11 years. I have examined what illness and accident and the ordinary violence of this country produce in the human body. I know what I saw. I know what it means in the context of what I have been observing since I arrived here. I am not going to write it in this journal, because writing it would require me to do something with it, and I have made my decision about what to do with it, which is nothing. The family that is missing from this property is not coming back. What became of them is contained in this property and in the behavior of the people I have spoken with today. I am going to ride back to Manchester, and I am going to say that I was called out for a minor medical matter and found nothing of concern, and I am going to say nothing further on this subject for the rest of my life. He kept this resolution. His journal contains no further reference to the Gooch property or to anyone in the Gooch family. When the family disappeared from the Clay County tax record in 1879, the last assessment at which the property was recorded as occupied, no inquiry, was opened. The property was listed as abandoned in the 1880 tax cycle and was eventually acquired by the county for non-payment of taxes in 1884. It was subsequently sold at a county land auction in 1887 to a buyer from Manchester who did not settle on it and sold it again in 1891. It changed hands 3 more times before 1910. None of the subsequent owners settled on the property for any significant period. The community that surrounded the Gooch property had, by the time of the 1883 deposition, established a pattern of behavior with respect to the land that was consistent across every family in the drainage. They farmed their own parcels. They conducted their own community affairs. They did not discuss the Gooch property among themselves in any form that produced a written record, and they did not discuss it with outsiders. Rhoda Benji's deposition passage was, by every indication, the only time any member of those neighboring families put what they knew into a form that an official record could contain, and it appears to have been an involuntary disclosure, a moment in which the weight of what she was carrying became greater than the discipline she had maintained for 7 years. The deposition was filed, the court clerk recorded it, nobody in the adjudicating proceeding asked a follow-up question. The passage sits on page 47 of a 60-page document that pertains entirely to a fence line dispute and has no apparent relevance to anything else in the file. It has been sitting there since 1883 today. The parcel that was the Gooch property in Clay County, Kentucky, is privately held agricultural land. It has been through many owners since the county auction of 1887, and there is nothing on its current surface that marks it as distinct from the surrounding terrain. The creek drainage it occupies is a quiet place in most seasons, cold and clear in spring and low in late summer. The county records show no structure standing on the property since the early 20th century. The house that was there in 1879 is gone without trace, which is not unusual for a timber frame structure of that age in that climate, left untended for decades. The nearest community cemetery has no Gooch family burial recorded. The family that lived on that parcel for 20 years left no grave in Clay County that anyone has been able to find. They left something else, though. They left the pattern of behavior in the neighboring families. The way that Rhoda Benji stopped buying meat from anyone in the years after 1876 and never explained why. The way that the circuit preacher rerouted his pastoral visits to avoid the eastern drainage entirely after 1879. The way that Dr. Hibbs, who rode to the Gooch property in October of 1879 and came back and said nothing, kept a journal for 24 more years and never wrote the name Gooch in it again, but also never described another property visit in the same way he described every other, which is with the full clinical detail that was his habit, because the October 1879 entry is the only one in 24 years of journal keeping that ends with a decision not to write what he saw. A decision not to write something is itself a document. It tells you that there was something that could have been written. It tells you that the person who decided not to write it understood the weight of what they were choosing to carry instead. Here is what this case asks you to consider. The cold cases that stay coldest are not the ones where the evidence is gone. They are the ones where the evidence was seen by people who made a collective decision that the official record was not the right place for it. In Clay County in 1879, a physician, a preacher, and at least one neighboring family looked at what the Gooch property contained and concluded that silence was the most manageable response available to them. They were not wrong about the limits of what official action could have accomplished. They may not have been wrong about anything except the longevity of that silence. The way it kept going long past the point where the people who made the decision were alive to maintain it, leaving it for the archive and the deposition and the journal entry to hold in their place. Was the silence a mercy as the preacher framed it, or was it the final act in a series of failures, by law, by medicine, by community, that allowed something to happen on that property for 3 years before anyone with the capacity to act did anything at all? Drop that in the comments, because the answer is not comfortable in either direction, and I want to know which discomfort you land on. If these are the cases that stay with you, the ones where the cold is not absence of evidence but presence of a decision not to speak, subscribe, and ring the bell. The county archives have more of these than anyone has been looking for. We will keep looking. Some hollows stay empty for reasons the property records never explain, and some decisions, to say nothing, outlast everyone who made them and settle into the ground with the rest of what those people chose to carry.